So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of animals. And when we look at the age of, or the estimated age of our planet, planet Earth, we see that Earth is estimated to be about 4.5 billion years old. Okay. So the first time that we start to see evidence of life, living things, living cells on the planet is about 3.5 to 3.8 years ago. So I'll just use 3.5, it's easy to remember. And this would have been the prokaryotic cells. So about 3.5 billion years ago, with just a B abbreviated. So when we talk about prokaryotic cells, you remember that prokaryotic cells do not have a nuclei. They are very similar to bacteria. We are not composed of prokaryotic cells. So when did the cells that make up our bodies, when did they arise on the planet? So we see that eukaryotic cells arose about 2.7 billion years ago. So eukaryotic cells about 2.7 billion years ago. So eukaryotic cells are believed to have evolved from prokaryotic cells. And one of the things that happened is we got a nucleus. So there is now a separate compartment for the genetic material. We also increased the size of the cells. So eukaryotic cells are larger. So these have a nucleus. They are larger, and they also have organelles. And some of the important organelles that are really interesting include the mitochondria, where almost all, actually all organisms, eukaryotic organisms have that, and also the chloroplasts. So this is only found in photosynthetic organisms. So those are the ones that are able to use light energy to capture carbon from the atmosphere and turn it into organic molecules. So when we look at these organelles, these are very interesting organelles because they have their own DNA. And that DNA is very similar to the DNA of bacteria, in that the DNA is actually circular and is called a plasmid, rather than it being in chromosomes, or which is what we find within the nucleus of the eukaryotic cells. They can also reproduce inside of the cell. So I'll put can reproduce inside of the cell. So this was a major event where we have essentially a larger cell incorporating smaller cells inside of it. And now those small cells have become such an integral part of the cell physiology that they cannot survive without them. And so this would be an example. What they call this is the Endo symbiotic theory. Remember, theories are big deals. Theory of the evolution of eukaryotic cells. So essentially, they acquired the genetic material from other cells that allow them, for example, to capture light and turn it into sugars, as in the case of the chloroplasts. But the mitochondria, though that allowed the cells to produce their own energy using oxygen. So that is where aerobic respiration occurs. So it's a really important part of being an animal, because this means that we can produce a lot of energy. So we can produce a lot of ATP using these mitochondria. So this was a very big deal in the evolution of not animals, but life on the earth, because we haven't gotten to animals yet. So let's look at the evolution of the multicellularity. So we can talk about being multicellular. So this is another major evolutionary event. And the reason why we think that organisms became multicellular, it allows them to increase in size. So this allows for an increase in size. The reason for this is that cells are limited in their size. So individual cells are limited in how large they can actually get. So let me see if I have my eraser here. Where is the eraser on here? Tools, eraser. Oh, there it is. That's what that is. Okay. So cells are limited in how large they can get. And so this is why we do not have very large cells like swimming around in the ocean. We don't have like these giant human-sized cells swimming around in the ocean. So in order for living things to become large, they actually had to become multicellular. And so when we look at this, the reason for this is that as you increase size, and this would be like the volume, you tend to get a decrease in the surface area to volume ratio. So if I have a small cell, like this one, let's say if it's just a cube-shaped cell, that is going to have a larger surface area to the amount of stuff that is inside of it. And this is really important because we need to be able to get oxygen and nutrients into the inside of the cell. Remember, it's the cell, the plasma membrane, that actually creates the boundary for the cell and how the cell maintains homeostasis. So if I increase the size of my cell, what I would find is that I would have a smaller surface area to volume. So this would have a smaller surface area to volume ratio. And so what that means is that there is less surface area over which they can get nutrients and get rid of carbon dioxide and get oxygen, for example. So the solution to this is not being just a single cell, but being composed of many, in our case, trillions of small cells. And each one of those cells is bathed in its own fluid. And so things can diffuse in and diffuse out. And then we have systems that are involved in the transportation of those substances into and out of the cell. So this evolution of multicellular, let's look it up. So evolution of multicellular time. When were the multicellular animals, multicellular organisms? Evolve is what I'm looking for. Okay, so it was about not until like 600 million years ago. And so we'll put up here about 600 million years ago. So we get this separation between plants and animals. So when we look at multicellularity, we can see that that evolved and that was an ancestral trait. So if I was to look at, say, for example, my phylogenetic tree, I might put plants up here, and then I might put fungi here, and I might put animalia here. And then I would put, as the ancestral trait, I would put multicellularity. Cellularity. So this is an ancestral trait. Okay. So when we look at the evolution of life, we can see that there are major branches. The plants are multicellular, as are the fungi and the animalia. These organisms right here are said to be heterotrophic. That means that they have to obtain nutrients and energy by eating things in their environment. The plants, on the other hand, are autotrophic, and that means that they are capable of photosynthesis. So that allows them to be photosynthetic. We do have some animals, which we're going to talk about, that have actually acquired the ability to become photosynthetic, but that would be not an ancestral trait. That would actually be a derived trait. Okay. So we'll talk about ancestral and derived traits repeatedly during this, this quarter. So one interesting thing about the evolution of animals is that the first animals were very soft-bodied. So this occurred in a period of time that your book calls the Edicarian. But so the first animals were soft-bodied. So maybe like sponges, right? Or cnidarians. So they didn't have a lot of structures to them. They didn't have a skeletal system. And then one interesting thing happened. We get this rapid evolution, which is referred to as the Cambrian Explosion. The reason why it's called an explosion is that it happened rapidly relative to geological time. So we're not talking like in a year or even in 100 years or even 1,000 years. We're talking about like millions of years, right? So this is relatively rapid evolution. And this was about 530 million years ago. And the reason why this is so significant, well, one reason why is that now we start to see fossil evidence. So these organisms tended to have hard skeletons. So they had hard structures that fossilized. Okay, so now we see fossil evidence, and there's some really famous areas high in the mountains, for example, where a lot of these fossils can be found. They are found generally where there were shallow lakes, and so there was a lot of sediment. And that type of sedimentation forms what is called a shale type rock. And one example of a place where they were really, really abundant was referred to as the Burgess Shale. Okay. And so this has been very well studied. And within this period of time, we start to see all of the major animal groups evolve. So for example, we see the echinoderms, which are like sea stars. We start to see the ancestors of those. We see the mollusks, the ancestors of those. Worms, which could have a hard outer shell or casing, like a tube worm. We see arthropods, like insects. Now, these aren't like modern day insects or modern day echinoderms. And chordates. So I'll put at the end of this ancestral groups. So we're not talking about chordates in particular. We're talking about the ancestor to chordates. All of a sudden shows up in that Cambrian explosion. It's crazy, right? And there's some hypotheses as to why this rapid evolution took place. And we'll explore some of those, but one of them is that oxygen became more abundant in the atmosphere. Another one is that there was lots of competition in these environments, which were shallow seas. We do not see any land organisms, land animals yet in the fossil record. So all of these were actually aquatic. And then we see also these organisms evolving and changing throughout the fossil record of that. And some of these organisms subsequently didn't make it, right? So they went extinct, but we get this massive rapid evolution. Okay. So we're going to talk more about the Cambrian explosion in another lecture.